Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this book launch and celebration of research and literature. My name is Marie Carrière. I'm the Associate Dean of Research in the Faculty of Arts, and I'm very happy to welcome you here today and to bring greetings from the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta. I realize that several of us are perhaps located differently, but I would like to begin with a treaty recognition of the location where I am today, and which is the location of the University of Alberta. And this treaty recognition was written by Lewis Cardinal, who is a woodland Cree from the Sucker Creek Cree First Nation. In recognizing where we are, I'd like to acknowledge that the city of Edmonton is on Treaty 6 territory, of which the city and its citizens have enjoyed the benefits. We acknowledge and honor all our ancestors, traditions, and spirits of this gathering place that first drew Indigenous peoples like the Cree, Nakota, Dene, Blackfoot, Métis, and then settlers to this special place. We acknowledge the spirit of the ancient and great gathering place in our river valley, in the heart of our city, that has for thousands of years been a peaceful and spiritual gathering place for trade, ceremony, and celebration. We acknowledge the traditions of trade and commerce that drew settlers here and enabled the forging of relationships that saw the creation of Treaty 6, the province of Alberta, and the city of Edmonton. And we acknowledge and honor that we still reside on Treaty 6 territory and together call upon those honored traditions and the spirit and intent of treaty to maintain us in a stronger and lasting relationship. It is my pleasure to introduce Nora Foster Stovel, whom we are celebrating this afternoon. Professor Stovel is a Professor Emerita at the University of Alberta and has taught ballet at the university level for over 20 years at Yale, Dalhousie, and Alberta. And you'll see why that's relevant in a moment. She has published and continues to work on Jane Austen, D.H. Lawrence, Margaret Drabble, Carol Shields, and Margaret Laurence, including Divining Margaret Laurence, a study of her complete writings. She has edited Jane Austen Sings the Blues and Jane Austen and Company in honor of Bruce Stovel. She has also edited the creation of I, Giselle, 19th century ballet meets 21st century video games, and with Donna Couteau, the volume that we celebrated last week, titled Early Writings by Margaret Atwood. Nora is conducting a number of other projects on Carol Shields' work, which have received assistance from a Shirk Insight grant and a U of A McCullough professorship. And so I'm very happy to welcome Nora.
Thank you very much, Marie. Merci bien. And welcome everyone, colleagues, students, friends, to this celebration of Margaret Laurence's essays. It's a new book published by McGill-Queen's University Press. And we have a few participants or speakers today. The first of them is David Laurence, Margaret Laurence's son. David is a photographer, and I just like to thank him for this wonderful photograph of his mother, which graces the cover of our book. I've always liked this photograph, and I didn't realize until David offered it to me that he had taken it. Once I knew he had taken it, it explained the rather complex expression on her face. I see love and pride at the same time as I see a bit of sense of humor and irony, which she was very good at. I imagine she was a bit amused at having her own son take a promotion photograph of her. Also going to mention that he gave me a wonderful photograph, an earlier photograph of his mother for a monograph on Margaret Laurence, also published by McGill-Queen's University Press a few years ago, called Divining Margaret Laurence. Also going to say that we have with us Professor and award-winning author Aritha van Herk, an author of a book on Margaret Laurence, Professor Laura Davis. Also like to welcome members of the McGill-Queen's University Press, especially Executive Director Philip Ciccone, Editor-in-Chief Jonathan Crago, and Mark Abley, who was the editor for this volume. And thank you so much, Mark, for all your good work. And last but not least, our copy editor, Kate Merriman. I'd also like to welcome members of the University of Alberta Press who may be with us today. Had the good fortune to work with them on 5 books, 2 of them on Margaret Laurence, including her collection of essays, Heart of a Stranger. David, thank you very much for joining us. David has contributed a wonderful preface or foreword to this book, which he has kindly agreed to read for us.
Thank you, Nora. It's a pleasure to be here. This book's certainly been a while in the making, I know, and you've been soldiering on for a long time trying to get to this point, I know. So it's really great to see it there, and it's a beautiful production that's been done, and so wonderful to see that it was included in the Carleton Library series. Without further ado, I'll read my my short foreword that you persuaded me to do. It's not something that I generally would do, get involved with my mother's work in that kind of way. But in this case, I think it was a good thing to do for me. So here's my foreword. My mother always seemed to me, as I was growing up, to be both full-time writer and part-time activist. Although over time, as the urgency of the first began to recede, the other advanced more to the fore. Consequently, it would be entirely wrong to assume that after publication of The Diviners in 1974, she spent the next decade pacing the floor, her typewriter having fallen silent with writer's block. This was not the case. By that year, my mother had managed to achieve a certain amount of fame, if not fortune, in this country, and arguably a status as closely akin to that of celebrity as could tastefully be allowed an author at that time in Canada. In other words, if she chose to speak up on a particular subject, the odds were fairly good that she'd be heard. Speak up she did, believing that if you've been given a voice, the obligation is there to use it. She was now able to devote more of her time to causes that had always been close to her, that she felt increasingly passionate about, such as environmental protection, human rights, nuclear disarmament. I remember the CND disarmament marches of the early 60s. And of course, gender equality, not to forget Canadian literature itself. She continued to be almost as busy during those final years as she had been throughout all the rest of her too short life. She talked a great deal, and she spoke out. But mostly, she did what she always had done. She wrote. Had she lived long enough to encounter the Twitterverse, who knows, perhaps her tired old typewriter friend might ultimately have been forced into retirement in favor of a computer. Frankly, though, it's hard to imagine her lightly tapping a computer keyboard, or heaven forbid, touchscreen, since she could often be heard pounding harder and faster at the typewriter keys, with increasing fury or joy, depending on the emotional content of the subject at hand, even to the point where typewriter letters broke and flew off through sheer metal fatigue. So no word processor for her. She only typed directly onto paper. But fast she was, and over the years she typed many, many letters, no doubt helping keep Canada Post in the black. Letters to people, both friends and not, to publications of all kinds, to companies, to government. She continued to write articles, essays, and reviews, and for other writers, she would often type up TMs, as she called them, tender messages, such as a positive quote for the back of the book jacket for an upcoming publication. She continually went out of her way to help other writers, other people, as much as she was able. She had a true generosity of spirit, yes, but was also driven by an almost unshakable faith in humanity and by the deeply held belief that if each of us tried our best, we would make our planet our only home, a better place for all, or at least increase its chances of survival. I'm very grateful to Nora Foster Stovel for all the time and effort she's expended in carefully assembling this collection of essays. And I hope that together they may present the reader with a door through which to encounter and get to know better the complex person behind the fiction. And certainly it does seem to me, although it's now a little over 30 years since my mother died, that much of what she wrote here remains relevant today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That's a wonderful preface. And I think, to me, the thing that's most amazing about these essays is how relevant they seem now. And I think we'll see that. I have a few very short bits to read to people. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs from my introduction. One paragraph more or less picks up on what David has just said in his foreword. In her memoir, Dance on the Earth, Laurence writes, "I believe we have to live as long as we live in the expectation and hope of changing the world for the better." She affirmed, "I am not by nature a revolutionary, but rather a natural born reformer," unquote. Nowhere is this reformist zeal more apparent than in her essays. It is unfortunate that these works are so little known simply because they have been largely unavailable. Because Laurence was in the habit of working out issues in nonfiction before dramatizing them in fiction, her essays illuminate her fiction, revealing Laurence as a socially and politically committed artist. These articles bring to the surface the socio-political undercurrents of her creative writing and help us read her fiction in a new light. Why, when Laurence was so admired as a writer of fiction, especially for her Manawaka saga, did she write so many essays, we might ask? Well, as a writer who lived by her pen, she needed the income, but there were other more interesting reasons. She had to defend her innovative fictional techniques against the negative criticism of reviewers, especially male academics, I'm afraid to say, regarding especially her early sister novels, The Jest of God and The Fire Dwellers. As a supporter of Canadian literature generally, she was often called on to discuss it. Most important, she was passionately interested in many issues, from the rights of women to those of Canada's Indigenous peoples, from pornography to censorship, and from ecology to nuclear disarmament. Nonfiction offered Laurence a forum for addressing topical issues about which she cared deeply, but which she could not address directly in fiction. And I'm just going to skip to the last paragraph of my introduction, and then I'm going to read a rather juicy quote from Margaret Atwood, from her Margaret Laurence lecture. Margaret Laurence's essays, the most neglected element of her writings, constitute the missing link that connects her beliefs with her fiction. They reveal her commitment to literature, particularly Canadian literature, and to Canada itself. They also reveal her passionate concerns regarding ecology and nuclear disarmament and equality, especially of Indigenous peoples and women, and they illuminate the socio-political undercurrents of her fiction, inviting us to read it with fresh eyes. Indeed, the issues she addresses, especially nuclear disarmament and the environment, are more pressing now than ever before in this time of drastic pollution, climate change, and nuclear buildups. It's interesting that Aritha is probably going to mention that the first novel by Margaret Laurence that she read was The Stone Angel. And it's also the first Laurence book that I read. It's the first book that Margaret Atwood read, and it's the first book that Carol Shields read. And in fact, it spurred Carol Shields to apply to do a master's degree in Canadian literature at the University of Ottawa in the early 1970s. So here is the quote from Atwood from her Margaret Laurence lecture, which she titles Margaret I and Margaret II. Margaret I is, of course, Margaret Laurence herself, whom she identifies as her role model. She lauds Laurence in the following terms. At her best as a writer, Margaret Laurence was amazing. As a participant in the emerging Canadian literary life of the 60s and 70s, she was crucial. Atwood describes the epiphanic experience of reading Laurence's first Canadian novel, The Stone Angel. The Stone Angel was one of those moments that were like beacons to young writers such as myself. It could be done then. The impossible dreamed up thing could be done. You could write a novel about Canada that was real and strong and authentic and smart and moving. It was like watching an albatross take off from a cliff top for the first time and spread its wings and soar. Yes, flight is possible. So let me turn to Aritha, who has written a wonderful afterword, and I think she is willing to read part of it or just to tell us a really good story about Laurence and Marian Engel. Welcome, Aritha. Well, she's probably very well known to all the people who have tuned in here as an award-winning author, not only a novelist, but a writer of books about the West, including Mavericks.
Thank you, Nora, and congratulations for the very hard work that you invested in collecting these important writings. It's a gift to Canadian literature. Laurence's last words in this gathering are, "To women in the future, I have to say, my hope is constant in thee." And rereading that, I was so moved because her comment and the context in which it is made provide a stark reminder of all that Laurence stood for and was. A forthright and careful thinker who was indeed beautifully uncertain, an uncertainty founded on hope and anticipation rather than any rigid judgment. When I get gloomy, I fear that we are increasingly a nation of magpies, so eager to acquire the new that we've relegated our forerunners and literary matriarchs to a position of retro quaintness without examining the path breakers that they were or what brambles they cleared to enable the multiple dimensions of women writing in Canada now. This edition is important because it is both recognition and revelation. A reminder that Margaret Laurence got to many destinations long before we did. Her writings are so much a part of the Canadian literary tradition that her words and her image hover in the background of our increasingly and wonderful diversity. Some, I know, have relegated her work to the mid-20th century. Hard to even imagine that now, but stalwart readers know that Laurence represents a breakthrough in Canadian words that even now hardly can be measured. And yes, every Canadian reader harbors a memory of the moment when they first encountered her work. My own was 1973 when I read The Stone Angel. And what struck me about it was its marvelous fury that one woman rejected growing old and was furious about it, juxtaposed with powerful memories of her past. I still have that old ragged paperback, an NCL edition with my marks in the margin and my name inside the front cover. Laurence's voice was distinctive, indelible, and I can still recite sentences from that novel, as I'm sure is true of most of you. In these essays, that voice rings out as powerfully as when the writings collected here were first published. This carefully curated compendium, invaluably ties together Laurence's fiction, life, and activism. These essays are less polemical than clear, balanced, and, as I said before, beautifully uncertain. Laurence was not a writer who pronounced or who dispensed unalterable opinions, but a thoughtful and considering observer of her world. Unsurprisingly, she was, as Nora's meticulous commentary unfolds, ahead of the pack in terms of her awareness of post-colonial writing, her resistance to exploitative power structures, and her anti-colonialism. Keenly aware of the power imbalance that women wrestle with, she directly addressed, and this is her quote, the dilemma and powerlessness of women, the tendency of women to accept male definition, to be self-deprecating and uncertain, and to rage inwardly. She was particularly sensitive, I think, to the work of women and how women writers are dismissed as privately focused rather than universal in their subject matter. She knew the cost of shopping, cleaning, cooking, and laundry, as she said, wryly observing that if you are a female heterosexual writer, it's not so easy to find an understanding and unpaid housekeeper. In short, a wife. Her wry appraisal of the differences between men and women concludes with the trenchant summary: in addition to doing my own writing, I am still my own housekeeper, secretary, and business manager. And I think we sometimes forget what a challenge that might have been. What is richest about these essays is that they capture Laurence's life experience. She's no retro thinker or a writer to relegate to Canada's history, but a woman both of her time and ahead of her time. Her support for unpopular causes, her sensitivity to racism and prejudice, her strong feminism and pacifism, her advocacy for peace and against censorship, all together remark an imagination whose influence goes beyond momentary context. I could not resist including in my afterword a story that Marian Engel told me about visiting a graduate class at the University of Alberta, probably somewhere around 1978. The graduate class was studying Laurence's The Diviners. Marian told me this story afterwards, but the class distressed her so much that she said, I threw a tantrum. I asked her why, and she related how the members of the graduate class, along with their professor, who will remain nameless, had apparently come to the consentient conclusion that The Diviners was a flawed novel, too chronological, not sufficiently experimental, and that it was not very good. This cavalier dismissal upset Marian beyond vehemence. She was literally swearing, 4-letter words, when she told me this. What did you do? I asked. I was furious, she said. I threw my glasses against the wall. They broke, and I shouted, do you know how long it took just to type this novel, you sniveling little runts? I laughed, of course, the sheer delight, because it was true. That was a time when we typed and retyped work, all of it, over and over. And then Miriam said, with that inimitable mischief that she had, and I'm not ashamed, I'd broken my glasses that morning. I glued them together with crazy glue, so I knew they were already broken, but the class didn't know that. So I used them to shock them into silence, and I'm so glad I did. That is what I respect and admire about writers like Laurence and Engel. They spoke their minds, and they knew that a creative mind could not be confined by subtle theoretical dances or squabbling critics. To this day, Margaret Laurence commands our attention, our passion. She makes us rethink what we thought we knew about Canadian writing and its contours. And her generous gathering of the best values, her huge-hearted sense of the country, contributed to her literary legacy in the fact that all writers now are inheritors of her journey. This volume contributes enormously to our awareness of her complexity. Nora Stovel, you have given, with your beautiful editing of these writings, the gift of reminder and memory. Thank you so much, and congratulations.
Thank you, Aritha. That was a wonderful, interesting, and perceptive talk. I really appreciate that very much. This was indeed a labor of love. Emphasize labor, emphasize love. My aim really has been to try to make more of Laurence's work more available to more people. And if it succeeded, then that's great. Thank you very much for joining us and giving us that wonderful presentation. So we have one more presenter today, Laura Davis, and I'm very happy to say that Laura was my student here at the University of Alberta. She was in a graduate seminar I taught on Margaret Laurence, where we covered, I think, virtually everything that Laurence published, except the essays, which were not readily available. Although I think we did read Heart of a Stranger. I had the privilege of supervising Laura's doctoral dissertation on Margaret Laurence, which she subsequently published. So she teaches English at Red Deer College, and her books include Margaret Laurence Writes Canada and Africa, which was the original thesis, Margaret Laurence and Jack McClelland Letters, edited with Linda Mora, and Essay Writing for Canadian Studies, co-authored with Roger Davis. So Laura, please tell us what your reaction was to reading some of these essays for the first time.
Thanks so much, Nora. And I'll just say, since you introduced me as your former graduate student, among other things, it was an absolute pleasure to work with Dr. Nora Foster Stovel for my PhD. And I don't know how many people can say that about their PhD studies, but it really was wonderful to work with you. So, and it's a pleasure to be here today and to present. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I'll just, I'll tell you a couple of short little stories that I was just thinking of as David Laurence was speaking and as Aritha van Herk was speaking, and then I'll jump into what I've written to say today. When I was working on the Laurence McClelland letters, I came across some in which Jack McClelland wanted to give Margaret Laurence an Apple computer. This was very early computer days. This would have been early 80s. I thought of it when David Laurence was talking about her typewriter and whether she would have liked Twitter or not. And anyway, in these letters, Margaret Laurence refused the Apple computer, and she said, "No, I'm good with my typewriter, and I know you're going to ask me to pose with this thing for a commercial or something, and I won't do that. I'm not going to promote Apple for you." And so she refused to do it. There's some very funny letters there, but then it actually went ahead without her, and there's a picture, a photograph by Karsh actually in that collection of letters with a bunch of other authors, including Margaret Atwood, posing with the Apple computer, just as she thought he would do. In fact, I think he said, "Actually, that's a good idea." So it was probably her that gave him the idea to get the authors to pose with the Apple computer. And the other short story I wanted to tell was my first my kind of love for Margaret Laurence goes back a long time. As a child, I was around the same age as the protagonist when her children's, I think her name was Sal, the children's book, The Olden Days Coat, came out, and it was gifted to me as a Christmas present. And I loved that book. And from there on in, we watched, they had, CBC had produced a version of The Olden Days Coat with Megan Follows in it, the one who later played Anne of Green Gables. And we watched that every Christmas. So that's how long I have liked Margaret Lawrence's work. I also remember before I really read her adult work, when she passed away, when Margaret Laurence passed away, my mom, who had read her fiction and loved it, sat us all down, our whole family, at the kitchen table and kind of announced that this was a big day because this great Canadian author had died. And I was really moved by how much my mom was moved by that. And it really kind of, I think, affected me. So anyway, that year led to years later doing all this work that I've done on Margaret Laurence. I have a fairly short kind of thing that I'll read about my response to the collection, which is absolutely wonderful. So I'd like to congratulate Dr. Nora Foster Stovel for the publication of this wonderful book, a collection of Margaret Lawrence's short essays. As we can see from the book, Laurence wrote many nonfiction works, and we finally have them all together in published form. As David Laurence says in his foreword to the book, it's incorrect to think that Laurence had writer's block after the publication of The Diviners. She did, in fact, tell people after she published that book, and Adele Wiseman talks about this, that she wouldn't write another novel again. Though she did, like probably many writers, have one or two unfinished manuscripts in her drawer. And I know Nora knows a lot about that because she wrote about one of the unfinished manuscripts in Divining Margaret Laurence. Instead, she turned her attention to children's books, as Stovel indicates in her introduction, and to using her voice to fight for a variety of issues: women's rights, diversity, nuclear disarmament, and the fight for equality and fairness in general. I love David Lawrence's description in the foreword of his mother typing quickly and furiously to the point where typewriter keys would sometimes fly right off of her keyboard. I just thought that was an awesome image that will stick with me. From Lawrence's letters, essays, and interviews, that's certainly the picture I have of her. Passionate, concerned about humanity and human rights. She never seemed to shy away from that which she felt was worth fighting for. So this book, Recognition and Revelation, I agree with what everybody said before. It's beautifully put together. It's divided into 5 sections, each of which highlights a theme about which Laurence wrote. So part 1 looks at Lawrence's writing about writing, her relationship with publishers, the subject which I have a particular interest having read and worked on the letters between Laurence and McClelland. Her belief that writers are political, as she most definitely was, and her sense of narration and time in her work. One of my favorite essays in the book is Time and the Narrative Voice. So maybe if we get a chance to read a passage at all, maybe I'll read a little from that one. Part 2 deals with the natural world and the author's relationship to it. It shows that Laurence, as a clear environmentalist, was ahead of her time, but it also shows how much she valued and understood the natural world, seeing it in a kind of spirituality and believing that humans belong to the world in which they live, not the other way around. Part 3 includes essays about Canadian literature. These essays show how committed she was to literature from her own country and how much she supported other writers, how much she believed in mentoring and supporting others in general. Parts 4 and 5 focus on her political writings, her many essays fighting for peace and nuclear disarmament, and her essays for various other political causes. Her essay on Joe Bass, written near the end of the civil rights movements, was, like her essays on environmental causes, ahead of its time. She speaks there of police brutality against African Americans, an issue which is front and center today. Lawrence's essays are now available then for the first time in published form and in a single collection, thanks to Nora Foster Stovel. They show Lawrence's personality and in them her commitment to her profession and to others, and her care and concern towards various causes. All of these themes come through strongly, and at times her humor and playfulness also shine through, and I love that. And I think that her humor and playfulness in these essays manifest a bit differently than those aspects do in her fictional writing. So we get a kind of a side of her that we maybe haven't seen before in these nonfiction writings. This is a wonderful collection of essays that's a major contribution to Canadian literature. It's fantastic and timely that these essays are now in print and available to the public. Of the various literary genres, the essay is perhaps the one most taught presently in a variety of university courses and writing courses as well as English courses. So there's no better time for a collection of Margaret Lawrence's short nonfiction writers to be published than now. So thank you for bringing the collection out and for your work on this and for this contribution to Canadian literature, and congratulations.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was wonderful. I also had invited another former student who took another graduate seminar on Margaret Lawrence's writings with me to join us today, Christian Riegel. Unfortunately, Chris says that he has had some kind of emergency to deal with that needs his attention, so he's not able to join us. But I'm just going to mention that he did publish the doctoral dissertation, which I had the privilege of supervising as a book called Writing Grief, Margaret Laurence and the Work of Mourning. He's also published 21st Century Canadian Writers, and he's the director of Impact, Interactive Media, Poetics, Aesthetics, Cognition, and Technology Lab at the University of Regina. So greetings to Chris, and we're very sorry that he couldn't join us. Thank you so much, Laura. You actually saved me a task because I was going to try to describe the layout of the book. There are over 50 essays, most of them previously unpublished, some of them previously uncollected, and some of them previously unpublished. I wonder if I could take a few minutes to just read you a few samples from some of her essays. One is from her wonderful essay, Sources, also called A Place to Stand On. It's the last paragraph. I remember saying once, 3 or 4 years ago, that I felt I had written myself out of that prairie town. And of course, that was Nipawin, Manitoba. I know better now. My future writing may not be set in that town, and indeed my novel, The Fire Dwellers, was set in Vancouver. I may not always write fiction set in Canada, but somewhere, perhaps in the memories of some characters, Manawaka will probably always be there, simply because whatever I am was shaped and formed in that sort of place. And my way of seeing, however much it may have changed over the years, remains in some enduring way that of a small town prairie person. I'm going to read the last paragraph of one of my favorite Laurence essays, which is called Ivory Tower or Grassroots. The novelist is socio-political being. Fiction has many facets, and I have mentioned only a few. For myself, it encompasses both history and belief, both social and spiritual themes. It speaks first and foremost of individual characters, and through them it speaks of our dilemmas and our aspirations, which are always in some way or other those both of politics and of faith. I mentioned her wonderful collection of what she calls travel articles titled Heart of a Stranger, which she published in 1976, and which I had the privilege of editing for a new publication by the University of Alberta Press in 2003. Although I would say that most of the essays are about her travels in Egypt, Scotland, Greece, and also not just travels, but sojourns in England and Somalia and Ghana. I did find that a few of the essays were more personal, such as this one, Where the World Began, about what it was like for young Peggy Weems, as she was then named, to grow up in Nipawin, Manitoba, rather, Freudian slip there. And some of the others are rather political, and I'm going to read a paragraph from the open letter to the mother of Joe Bass, which Laura Davis mentioned. The opening paragraph of Where the World Began. A strange place it was, that place where the world began, a place of incredible happenings, splendors and revelations, despairs like multitudinous pits of isolated hells, a place of shadow spookiness, inhabited by the unknowable dead, a place of jubilation and of mourning, horrible and beautiful. It was, in fact, a small prairie town. Some of her essays, including A Matter of Life or Death, are about nuclear disarmament, as Laura has mentioned, which she says is the most important issue of our time, and I think that is still the case. Here's a paragraph from her essay, Operation Dismantle. Social services are being cut drastically in America and may soon be cut in our own country. Our universities are suffering cutbacks. Does this sound familiar? Unemployment is rife. People throughout the world suffer from preventable diseases, from starvation, from thirst, from homelessness, from hopelessness. Yet $550 billion are spent worldwide on armaments, including nuclear arms, and the sum is increasing. To me, this is not only insanity, it is brutality. And finally, I'll read a paragraph from Open Letter to the Mother of Joe Bass. Joe Bass was a 12-year-old African-American boy who was shot by police in Detroit. The police were trying to shoot a white man who was exiting a liquor store with a stolen 6-pack of beer. And the boy caught a bullet in his neck. The picture shows the boy lying on the pavement with his hand in a pool of his own blood. This letter by Margaret Laurence is an open letter addressed to his mother. I look at the picture of your 12-year-old son on the sidewalks of Detroit, pillowed in blood, and I wonder if it were in fact my son of the same age, would I be able to go on writing novels in the belief that this was a worthwhile thing to be doing in this year, as I say, of our Lord? Mrs. Bass, I do not think I can answer that question. I am afraid for all our children. And of course, that fits totally into the current Black Lives Matter and police brutality movement against police brutality. Thank you all very much. I want to thank our presenters, especially David Laurence, Aritha van Herk, and Laura Davis. I want to thank again the McGill-Queen's University Press team and the University of Alberta Press team. I also want to thank our hosts from the University of Alberta Faculty of Arts, including Oliver Rossier and Cindy Welch, and our technicians, Claire Peters and Grant Wang. And thank you, Marie, again, for your wonderful introduction and welcome. So thank you all very much. Thank you to all our guests.